In this presentation, I will talk about Pochoir history and methods. Pochoir is a method of printing using stencils that was popular in Europe, particularly France in the late 19th and early 20th century. Traditionally, the image is cut into a stencil made from a fine sheet of metal, though a cardstock paper can be used today, especially for smaller editions or variable editions and monoprints. To create the image, a water-based pigment is applied by hand using a variety of different brushes. When creating an edition, a separate stencil is required for each color, sometimes up to 20 being used. The thickness of the pigment, the number of layers with the stencils, as well as the type of brush or tool, all affect the final look of the print. Bouchoir can also be used to add color to a print using a more conventional printmaking process such as lithography, intaglio, etc. Here we have an example of Bouchoirs depicting butterflies from a collection from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their website has a number of good examples to look at. Here is a Bouchoir by Sonia Delaunay from the 1920s that show ways in which Bouchoir can lend itself to more abstract images. Notice the very subtle areas of blue and green on the lower part of the image. Also, the dark area between the green and the orange resulted from an overlap of those two roughly complementary colors. And here's a Roald Dufy from the 1920s. In this case, the outlines would have been very small openings in the Bouchoir stencil. The website for the Special Collections Library at Princeton University has a very instructive set of progressive proofs showing Bouchoir created by Thomas Maitland Cleland. The cutouts used in making the stencil print are in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Depicted here are the Bouchoir plates for this print on the left, The Advertising Man from 1929. So in the uppermost corner is the first run with Bouchoir, a light gray, and below that is the second color, a slightly cooler gray, and then on the lower right in the center here are those two layers combined. So this represents the first two stencils that make up the print. Here are stencils 3 and 4, in which alternately cool and warm colors are used. Also, blue and orange as complements start to mix and create grays. Here is red and green as two other color layers. More cool colors, particularly in shadow areas for stencils 7 and 8. Additional accents with red and darker areas of gray. You also notice that not all colors are applied evenly, so you can selectively build up color in certain sections of the stencils. You see that especially with the gray stencil on the lower left. And here is the resulting print. I think it's important in this process to consider the values of the colors and their translucency to allow the white of the paper to create the image. Lauren Kusrow, an alumna of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, has a really excellent YouTube demo on Bouchoir that I refer you to. You simply go to YouTube and put in her name and Bouchoir, and you'll find that link. Some of the materials we're using for this project in Printmaking Without a Press are yellow, magenta, and cyan acrylic paint. You can also use matte medium to create more transparency, and the tools here, a soft brush, a stencil brush, but what are effective are foam, rubber squares and pads. People have also used makeup applicators and things like that. So what I've done to show you the Bouchoir method is I've cut kind of freehand out of some cardstock, some leaf-like shapes and patterns here. And to test this, I'm going to do it on another piece of cardstock just to proof it up. And what I've got is acrylic paint, cyan here, And I'm going to apply this with two different things. I've got a soft brush, and using a brush like this, I can first work it up on a separate piece of paper and kind of strip it and get it sort of dry brush. Sometimes people do it on the edge of the, and then with this you can build up a subtle gradation of the color. And the exciting thing about Pochoir is to do this in such a way that you can create some transitions. So you can see that it's very different from painting. There are stencil brushes you can get that cost a bit more, but this soft brush will work, and it will give you some opportunities to create transitions in form. So I can go light, and then, so anytime I put the paint on the brush, I'm going to try to dry brush and strip that back a little bit. And then I can go to a darker edge over here. So you can see some of the possibilities here with these transitions. So the goal here is to have so little pigment that it's not going to undercut under those areas. Now there are other tools you can use, sponges. This is just a piece of foam rubber, and what I would do when doing this is take your brush and sort of create a even area of it, and then it's good to do this on a paper plate. Then you can sort of build up a little bit of this on that. So this becomes a good, you can test it on another piece of paper, but for getting really soft, even areas here, I can get some beautiful little subtle transitions of color here. So the thing about Bouchoir is because you're using something like paint and you're using a brush, you tend to think of it as being like a paint medium. But in fact, it's much more, to have control at the stencil, you have to use much less pigment. So you can see the ways that some of that subtlety is happening there. And I can combine these tools. You can experiment with things you get at the beauty salon. You can use larger stencil brushes. There's lots of ways to sort of explore building this up. I'm going to come back in here with a little bit of the brush, start it on the edge, and then bring it in. Kind of work vertically into it there. Back with the foam. Depending upon what sort of effects and what sort of thing you want to do. So a lot of the exciting parts happen along the subtle transitions at the edges. So here you see, particularly in this one and this, where you see those possibilities. You can always lay the stencil back down and rework areas if I want to. The other thing that's real exciting about it is you can create very light areas that you then have layers and transitions by putting two light areas of stencil marking through overlapping each other. So you get a little bit of the idea there. So it's just a question of experimenting with these, seeing how they work in layers, and also let them dry a little bit between each layer, whether you're using the same color or a different color. Experiment and have fun. So in this example, I'm showing you how I'm using a template that's cut from the same paper I'm printing on. This template has a window that corresponds with the size of the stencils I'll be using to make the Pochoir print. My stencils are made from 8.5 by 11 inch cardstock, and I'll be printing on 11 by 15 inch Stonehenge white paper. So this template, which is being held to the printing paper with binder clips, will remain in a stationary position throughout the printing process. Next, I'm showing you a key drawing that I made onto the cardstock that I'll use as a guide. You could also use a photograph that's printed multiple times from a laser printer for the same purpose. And then using that guide on a light table or a window, I can trace out the various stencils that I cut out with an X-Acto for yellow, for blue, and the next stencil here for a warm magenta color. And this is the sequence of the stencils that are printed with the pigment onto the Stonehenge paper. And finally, a shadow stencil made of magenta and cyan pigment. And this is what the completed print looks like. So to conclude, I'll show some example Pochoir prints by students Kathy Glass, Coda Bowers, Hannah Crow, and Alice Irizarry. All these are printed on quarter sheet Stonehenge white paper from the Printmaking Without a Press course fall of 2020. In this Pochoir print by Kathy Glass, you can see the potential of limiting your palette to use a monochromatic scheme, and that the shadow areas are then created by combinations of yellow and cyan. Here we see another print using the same stencils but in different combinations. The orange dress here is created by applying yellow over magenta rather than magenta over yellow. Here she's experimenting with ways of applying the pigment through the stencils. In this print, many of the values to produce black are produced through combinations of the primary colors, although one can also mix those colors together before applying them through the stencils. What makes this especially rich are those areas where we can see the cyan or magenta through portions of the black. And here again, you can see the potential of thinking about the Pochoir stencil to create variable additions, to explore different kinds of color combinations. In many of these prints, reserving areas of white is especially important because this gives the print a sense of luminosity. You can see this variable application of density of pigment, for example, for the light area in the upper portion of this print by Hannah Crow. And this is something important to consider because you can create highlights along edges, such as the upper edge of the parrot in terms of how the stencils are cut or placed, as well as lights created by lighter applications of pigment. Or you can experiment with different kinds of unexpected reversals of value. But generally, when you use a full range of yellow, magenta, and cyan, can you produce the broadest range of secondary color mixtures and so forth. This is another example of a black and white print. In this case, the primary colors were mixed together on a palette to produce grays, which were then applied through different stencils and different densities to produce the different tonal variations. This is a particularly exciting subject because the sleeping figure then allows for variability for different kinds of dream states or moods. In this one, you can see ways in which cut paper stencils are used and shifted to create areas of the wall behind the figure. So I hope this presentation on the history and methods of Pochoir will be helpful and will allow you to think differently about ways of making prints without a press.